As I was standing at Starbucks a few minutes ago, waiting for coffee, I took out my copy of The Ancient Mariner, which is relevant to today's talk, and opened the page to "This hermit good lives in the wood, which slopes down to the sea. He'll shrive my soul, he'll wash away the albatross's blood." Judith has been very prominent in many fields, in women's studies, in Victorian studies. She is the Newton College Alumni Chair in Western culture. She is a kind of pioneer for many of us in the area of religion and literature, particularly accented in the direction of Catholicism and Victorian literature. And I read that passage because, as I'm standing at Starbucks, it suddenly hits me, wow, there's a shriving hermit who plays a major role at the end of The Ancient Mariner. And Judith, in a way, has taught me to not pass over things like that so blithely, but to say, what's going on here with our Western culture and its various striations. So I'm extremely pleased to welcome Judith Wilt to our.
Thank you. I brought 3 editions of Frankenstein along. There are plenty more. Some of you have already read 2. And I hope there might be a little time at some point to talk about the various editions of Frankenstein. I have a couple of remarks to make about that along the way. I want to hark back to the lecture 2 weeks ago where Father Bob Barth offered this group a vivid tableau of the romantic imagination in action. The divine idea engages the human actor. A marriage results, one empowered by language religiously trusted to reach and represent the real. The imagination impregnates, quoting Coleridge's The Statesman's Manual here, impregnates human understanding, and the symbol is born, a timely repetition of the eternal I am. The symbol gathers and endows meaning, reconciling, mediating, incarnating. Not without some mystery, this process, not without a little edge, but the seams of these inseminations and births, the sutures of these unitings and sunderings seem all but invisible. And now for another rougher view from the Gothic imagination, the unreconciled, the abjected, the post-carnate, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. When the creature in this tale, son of God, son of man, motherless, son of his father, raises his eyes at the end from the body of the dead God, man, son, to the teller and the reader of this tale, this is what he says: "In his murder, my crimes are consummated. The miserable series of my being is wound to a close." How haunting is this phrase, the series of my being. I am. How haunting the culminating phrase, wound to its close. Turn of the screw, wound to a close. And on the page, this enigmatically trustworthy language turns further, reads, wound to a close. Wound towards a close. Wound never really closes, never fully closes the wound between the inseminated I am and the agonized I am. The seams always leaking between the variant metamorphoses of the self. I am this, I am that. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy. Am I not alone, miserably alone? Yet when I gaze upon the world, it incites within me a desire to become an actor in the busy scene. A young girl comes running out of the busy scene. She falls into a stream, and I rushed from my hiding place and with extreme labor saved her from the force of the current and dragged her to shore. A rustic tore her from my arms, fired a gun at my body. I writhed under the miserable pain of a wound which shattered the flesh and bone. Later, a beautiful child approached, and an idea seized me. I could seize him and educate him as my companion and friend. Hideous monster, let me go. My papa is Monsieur Frankenstein. I grasped his throat to silence him, and in a moment he lay dead at my feet. I exclaimed, I too can create desolation. The esemplastic imagination, the creative act. This is the chilling credo of the Gothic anti-hero in the Western tradition. From those monster lords of feudal empires who attempt to disrupt old lines of inheritance, and those monster monks of the Counter-Reformation who turn God upside down, to the 20th century's serial killers with their mordant restagings of the 7 deadly sins and the Last Supper, the defiant exercise of the primary imagination. I too can create desolation. Theirs is an aesthetics and a theology of suffering, and an identity of suffering, too. Edmund Burke's essay on the sublime and the beautiful had revived the Greek conception that suffering produces wisdom in the bodily registering of pain and terror as the strongest sensation. The essay put on the table again the human body's mysterious cleaving to its own suffering as the vessel of its consciousness. Theologian Albert W.J. Harper comments this way on the complex dynamic of suffering and consciousness. Conscious suffering suffers from at least a twofold conflict. The mind is desirous of bringing its suffering to an end and conquering it by coming upon a reason for its suffering. But the pride of consciousness also wants to make the most of the conscious state it feels it possesses in what has been described as the loquaciousness of suffering. This is a term from Elaine Scarry's influential study, The Body and Pain, to express pain's agency in expressing the aliveness, the sentience of mortal flesh. It is in this context that the Gothic anti-hero has built himself on and as the pearl of his anguish, suffering with and through his victims. It is his own excess he pursues and creates and worships in their agony. And indeed, what Frankenstein, with its 2 anti-heroes, contributes to the genre is precisely the confirmation that suffering is being is suffering. The greatest being is the greatest suffering. And to be bested in a contest of suffering is to suffer a theft of identity. Victor Frankenstein has, it seems, the upper hand in this contest for suffering being, for he has a host of beloved others knit into the human life of his embodied spirit, plus an enemy inquisitor who forcibly rips them out one by one, achieving for him that accumulation of suffering which brings consciousness to the brink just short of madness, which is the classical spiritual locus of the Gothic experience. Once Victor saw an oak tree come dazzlingly alive in the shattering grip of a thunderbolt, elegantly reduced to the elemental ribbons of wood. He experienced awe. I had never beheld anything so totally destroyed. He experienced desire. Electricity, my father answered. The angel of electricity, traversing sky to earth, creation to destruction, desire to remorseful desire, does its work crackling between the 2 Frankensteins. The son shocked into life, a convulsive motion agitated its limbs, and the father shocked beyond life. I am a blasted tree, the bolt has entered my soul. The angel of electricity, moving reversibly between the poles of the power and the power to suffer the power, does not depart the novel's universe at the end. In the last pages, the second Frankenstein is still contesting the place of suffering being with the departed Victor. He suffered not the 10,000th portion of the anguish that was mine. No crime, no mischief, no malignity, no misery can be found comparable to mine. And finally, blasted as thou wert, my agony was still superior to thine. What next? What next? In writing of the romantic sublime, the angel of electricity is visible over and over as a current, sometimes fire, sometimes air, sometimes water, always fluid. A current between the pole of the divine and that of the human condition. One pole is the elemental force which the speaker of Shelley's Mont Blanc feels coming down the valley of the Arve, which Byron's Manfred went up the mountain to draw forth. This is the unnameable energy which dwells within all things, what Father Barth quoted Coleridge in a more benign mood calling the background ordering of all things. Mysteriously ordering sometimes, we have to admit. In Gothic mode, it is ready to kill, ready to galvanize, source of the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Only by this pole's invisible presence can be illuminated the other pole, the human condition, the wondrous capacity of the flesh to absorb shock. Of what materials was I made, Victor cries, beholding the dead friend Clerval, that I could thus resist so many shocks, which, like the turning of the wheel, continually renewed the torture. Great God, he cries at the catastrophe of his wedding night. Why did I not then expire? Could I behold this and live? And more interestingly still, why am I here to relate this? Of what was I made? Immortal matter, romantic biologists reply. Could I behold this and live? Yes. The vertiginous bilocation between suffering spectacle and the spectacle of suffering is intrinsic to the human condition and fundamental to the theology of suffering. So is the body's strength to admit and endure this vertiginous bilocation. So is the heart's capacity to circulate it. Why am I here to relate this? Because bearing witness, confessing, both engages the circuits of remorse, sorrow, forgiveness, and circulates further the coin of the realm of consciousness, which is suffering. The experience of sympathy. This linking of one body's suffering strength with another body's enhanced life troubles the soul, even as it follows the line of empiricist Enlightenment thinking on association and sympathy. For as Stephen Broome points out in his provocative Gothic Bodies, the politics of pain in romantic fiction, there can be very dangerous surges and overloads in the currents of sympathy. Tracing the arguments for the physiological basis of social sympathy and the pain-terror foundation of Burkean aesthetics, Broome sees the potential for a slide from the empathetic ethic, I know how you feel, to the cooptative anti-ethic, this hurts me more than it hurts you. Here, the empathetic spectator may even become a torturer, sympathetically moving into the virtuous space of the victim, the life space of the other, erasing his interiority, even claiming his flesh, the shocked flesh, as his own prosthesis. Such may be the politics of the revolutionary state or the counter-reformational church, whose torturers incite the Western mind. Such, closer to the bone, seems the politics of the universe of Abraham and Isaac, the universe of the sacrifice of Christ, scapegoat, atonement, ransom, the spectacle of the one death that all may participate in and emerge from shocked into higher awareness, the one body into which all are poured, then poured out. The creature made up out of parts from criminals and sinners and raised up in a paroxysm crossing death and redemptive life. No wonder filmmakers have tried to imagine a creature with a murderer's hand or a madman's brain, falsely included, still active. Have pictured him raised in a mechanical apparatus to catch or cause a Good Friday storm. Or to bring it back to my haunting phrases again, in what part Of what series is my present experience bodily of my life? Against what background does my drama acquire an order? Does the wound of my seriality close ever upon a future self, upon some completion of being in another, human or divine? Am I a wound in the side of God or man, or is it vice versa? In Mary Shelley's novel, the creature answers himself this way, speaking to the polar explorer Robert Walton, witness narrator in the serial appearances of Victor Frankenstein and Victor's Frankenstein. He says, "My work is nearly complete. Neither yours nor any man's death is needed to consummate," here it is again, "the series of my being. It requires my own death. Do not think that I shall be slow to perform this sacrifice." As the last term in the series, the creature thinks, the work of his death will erase the series. He is dead who called me into being, and when I shall be no more, the very remembrance of us both will speedily vanish. But another series actually beckons. Since consciousness orders itself as a series, it cannot end its series. Perhaps, he whispers to the dead Victor, perhaps in some mode unknown to me thou hast not yet ceased to think and feel. If so, he allows even more secretly to himself, his sleepless consciousness will enter that mode too. My spirit will sleep in peace, or if it thinks, it will surely not think thus. What, the novel's paradoxically most human creature wonders, what would thought be like in a mode or register not thus? A mode free from the wound between subject and object, self and self, human and divine, consciousness and consciousness of. A wound which is the very aliveness of the human, pulled apart poles presided over by the angel of electricity. Well, Frankenstein, as you know, is itself a series that does not end, a series of rewritings, refilmings, reversionings. In my own reading lifetime, the novel has patiently submitted to the importunate embraces of one after another meaning giver and been reborn as a different exemplar in each decade. In the 1950s, Frankenstein, the novel, was a dire warning about a human science divorced from moral and religious safeguards. In the 1960s, Victor Frankenstein was an ambitious careerist patriarch whose separation from the emotional life of family took shape as a family-killing evil twin. In the 1970s, feminist analysis matched the novel to Mary Shelley's journal records of painful miscarriages and mourned dead babies, and found dark parables of both of the terrors of natural pregnancy for women and of feminine fury at the bypassing of natural childbirth for male-male begetting. In the 1980s, Frankenstein's creature became the post-colonial type of a dozen monstrous political, racial, or even species others. And so, by the 1990s, inevitably, the novel had become its interpreting readers, become a sign of the instability of interpretation itself. So that the effort that Professor Robert Stanton talked about in the first lecture in this series, the effort to police the borders between truth and interpretation, had given way to a contemporary effort just to follow out the implications of each interpretation without police, letting what Professor Bob Barth called last time the faith that word can contact world take care of itself, that is, take care for many parallel braided worlds contacted by word. I myself have delighted in each new net to catch the novel in. How to read and teach it as genre. Is it Gothic or science fiction? How to gauge the paradoxical feminist analysis of its allowing Victor to recognize that the woman he could create would have a mind of her own, and of allowing him to destroy her for exactly that reason. How to assess the mixed colonial discourse of its Christian feminine Arabian and its evil Turk, of the creature's dream of hiding himself in the imagined unpeopled spaces of empire. But for me, Frankenstein remains at bottom a religion and literature text, set at the beginning of the century, which would experiment with making religion into literary text, and vice versa, would experiment with deriving moral philosophy from natural philosophy rather than vice versa, would experiment with just experiment, all of its characteristic works of culture providing conclusions but not really completions, as if the 19th century knew with science that only a repetition can confirm the truth of the experiment, as if it knew with art that there will always be a sequel. The first time I wrote on Frankenstein in the 1970s, on the way to talking about ghosts of Enlightenment and Romantic Gothic and mainstream Victorian novelists, I found I had devoted 10 pages to a quite fantastic notion of the novel as a mystery play. Victor Frankenstein raises his hands over the mortal scraps on his table and calls down into them the ideal, I wrote. There is in the ordinary celebration of this mystery always a space between the cross, the altar, and the congregation. But it makes all the difference in the circling story of Victor Frankenstein that there is no community present at this Mass, not even an altar boy. Igor was invented by filmmakers. Without the presence of the community, somewhere behind, this dynamic is lost and a doomful transference occurs. For this would-be priest choose to play God, and the deity points out the position is already occupied. I returned to the novel 10 years later in a conference paper which directly tried to address my haunting by the phrase, the series of my being. This was a paper energized, for me at least, by conversations with a mathematician friend about number series. I remember 2, 4, 6, 8. How do we appreciate the orderly progressions of mathematics? Except in a phrase I love, Richard Jensen informed me that the series is not always as well behaved as humanists would like to think. Students of the mathematical series, whether in the microcosm of Zeno's paradox or in astrophysics, are always up against the deepest, most unsolvable conundrums of continuity and infinity, continuity to infinity, continuity, therefore absurdity, wound to a close. My most recent return to the novel emphasized the genre series of which Frankenstein is a part. It put together in one text, with introduction and context, Mary Shelley's 1818 novel and H.G. Wells's 1896 novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau, both of them warning texts about the enterprise the 19th century held most dear, making humans human. There, I was interested in the pan-religious, pan-science stew of ideas that was the 1790s, where the angel of electricity and the alchemical god of the sun lit up comparative religious studies and comparative biophysics, both of them on the move in new scientific expressions emphasizing the promise of a luminous renewability in, this is one of the era's favorite world-contacting words, plasticity. Here, for instance, was a lovely Frankensteinian verse I found in Erasmus Darwin's The Temple of Nature, which the Shelleys knew well. Hence, when a monarch or a mushroom dies, a while extinct the organic matter lies, but as a few short hours or years revolve, alchemic powers the changing mass dissolve. The wrecks of death are but a change of forms. Emerging matter from the grave returns, feels new desires with new sensations, burns. Which seems to suggest that if Victor Frankenstein had not invented this returning matter, burning with desire, it would return on its own. Well, where am I now? Asked by Dennis to return to thinking about Frankenstein. As you can see from the first part of this presentation, the novel is still very much an incitement to me for religious thinking. It's another term in the series which moves from the active primary imagination in Genesis and the accompanying Job to the Protestant Reformation and its Greco-Roman classics-framed masterwork, Paradise Lost, to this echo of that eternal I am in the mind of a teenage girl in 1816 to 1818. By the way, we could think longer about the textual series of the novel's being, how internally it moves from a brother-sister letter series, which might have come right out of Shelley's Epipsychidion, toward a braided and competing doublet of narratives from a son who becomes a father and a creature who learns to create. Or again, we could think about the material existence of the novel Frankenstein. The material existence begins as an incorporeal series of conversations in the summer of 1816, a storytelling evening among writers in which there may or may not, nobody quite knows, have been writing aids. It continued as a tutorial writing enterprise, which you can actually see in James Rieger's 1974 edition, showing Mary's handwritten text with Percy's firmly inserted corrections and suggestions. It saw publication in 1818 with a preface actually written by Percy, and the series continued toward a famous or infamous Victorian edition of 1831, which turns out to be the one you now have, in which Mary Shelley, widowed, disillusioned, and financially needy, wrote additions which somewhat straightened out the aggressive and contradictory Victor Frankenstein of the 1818 edition, where she, Marilyn Butler argues, actually gave Victor Frankenstein a religious consciousness, even a Christian consciousness. If you'd like to take a look at these emendations and additions, by the way, Marilyn Butler prints them all out in her World's Classics edition of Mary Shelley Frankenstein, emphatically in the title, the 1818 text. You can imagine scholars pointed and often superior-sounding regret at these Victorian and Christianizing additions. But the 1831 text has interests and virtues of its own, I'd argue, though I don't have time to argue them here. One aspect of all this I didn't discover actually until reading another biography of Mary Shelley for this presentation. The Victorian publisher Richard Bentley, for the 1831 edition, actually required that all the authors he was republishing in his new series revise their novels so that he could buy and own the copyright for them. In any case, as I come back to Frankenstein this semester, I bring a sharper eye for actual religious history, an eye that prompts the series and the title of this presentation, Frankenstein, Catholic, Protestant, Atheist. In choosing this subject with the dual authorities of Aeschylus' Prometheus and Milton's Adam speaking to one another on the title page, Mary Shelley figures the moment about which Professor Dayton Haskin will probably talk in your next lecture, a moment and a movement when spiritual verities and alivenesses of all kinds were perceived to be traveling toward the status of myth, and religious experience toward those interactions with imaginative text that would make writers, readers, and critics of literature new contenders for the old title of the clerisy. Now, Mary grew up the daughter of free-thinking Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. She moved in radical circles all her early life. For her and those she knew, Catholic, Protestant, Atheist would be the normative series of Western humanity's being. Religious tolerance was the face of religious freedom for the time, but freedom from religion, the still controversial edge of free-thinking doctrine. Percy Shelley was sent down from Oxford for printing heresies in a pamphlet flamboyantly titled The Necessity of Atheism. William Godwin became Shelley's financial and intellectual patron in this context, and his teenage daughter delightedly welcomed copies from the poet's hand of his later pamphlet, A Refutation of Deism. In Percy's work, both Catholic Rome and state-sponsored Anglicanism dripped the blood of their tyrannous enforcement. Both were the mothers of monsters. When the Shelleys and Byron and their friends sat down in their Swiss lodgings in the summer of 1816 to tell each other stories of terror and horror, the Gothic tradition behind them had firmly established Catholicism as the center of tyranny and torture, the opposite of flexible humanism, over against the truer Christian remnant of Protestantism in England. In that same summer, however, of 1816, Walter Scott set to work on a novel of 17th century British religious strife. The novel Old Mortality, which was a huge bestseller all during the time Mary Shelley was actually writing Frankenstein, actually featured a number of crazed Calvinist absolutist monsters who inaugurated a tradition of Protestant Gothic which was fixed forever by James Hogg 6 years later in his novel The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. As a final move in this presentation, I'd like to take a look at two moments where I think I see these Gothicized Catholic and Protestant pasts revived again in Frankenstein, and whether the narrative stages these as vestigial traces in the social body happily moving to atheism, or as the inevitable return of the repressed, I leave you to work out. First, a suggestive geography. The Frankensteins, Victor and his father, are aristocrats of the Genevan Republic, heirs of John Calvin's dream of the city-state of God. Victor's experiments, on the other hand, take place at Ingolstadt, a Bavarian university town associated in the 16th century with the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and in the 18th century with the Illuminati, one of those heterodox religio-scientific movements whose insistent search for secret knowledge of the spirit life behind the veil of the universe was associated with Jews and pagans, while Catholicism was the reigning orthodoxy, and with renegade Catholics in later Protestantized realms. The family de Lacy, with whom Frankenstein's creature learns language, sociality, and the most painful lesson of his own outsiderhood, that family is French and Catholic, exiled by the state to Germany for befriending the Turkish Mahometan father and Christian Arab mother of Felix's lover Safi, and self-exiled further rather than befriend the creature. And the aborted experiment of a female creature forms the excuse for a journey through England to the Gothic terrain within Britain, that is, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, with a key stop along the way in Oxford, which is notable in the novel not as a university town, but as the site of a key battle in the Puritan Anglo-Catholic War of the English Revolution. The Catholicism made Gothic in the English tradition is visible in this novel, especially in the evil confessor who wields power over the souls of the family of Justine Moritz, the French servant of the Frankenstein family, whom they admitted to their own family because her Catholic mother, for inexplicable reasons, could not endure her, shades of Victor and his creature. When her sisters and brothers at home died one by one, her mother began to believe that these deaths were heaven's judgment for her partiality to them, and her confessor confirmed the idea which she had conceived. Returning to comfort her mother, the suffering Justine found the mother accusing her of actually having caused the deaths of her brothers and sister. Returning back after her mother's death to the Frankenstein, the luckless girl participates in the search for the missing Frankenstein child, is discovered sleeping in a barn by the furious creature after his murder of William. As revenge on the femininity forever withheld from him, and as a way of expanding his crime and his suffering, the creature places the picture of the Frankenstein mother, worn by William, in the folds of Justine's dress. And once again she is accused falsely of the death of a child. Of course, asserts Victor when he agonizingly discovers all this, the tortures of the accused did not equal mine. His grief was doubled by his remorse. But then Justine bids herself up in that game and confesses to the crime, adding remorse to her grief. Victor cannot stay away naturally, although, or rather because, this visit was torture to me. Justine tells him that the priest had besieged her, had threatened and badgered her conscience, until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. Under this inquisitional torture, she believed and confessed, and now suffers the double remorse torture for the lie that tortured Elizabeth and Victor. Now, visible here is the Reformation accusation that Catholic Christianity, by subtle or brutal tortures, had allowed a priesthood to control that inward I am, which should echo only the divine act of creation or self-creation, an authority over interiority which Protestant Christianity had restored. But complicating this is that appearance once again of torture envy, the rush to self-conviction of sin common to Augustinian Catholicism and Puritan Protestantism, but here fixed to the image of the torturer's wheel, which is the symbol of Catholic absolutism, both in feudal and in early modern times. So the place of the monster, swollen with absorbed aspects of victim and violator, hypersentient with pain, is unstable, dangerously alluring, a divine spectacle offered for imitation, a hair's breadth from pornography, blasphemy, and ignominy, as the Marquis de Sade's own novel, Justine or the Trials of Virtue, had shown 10 years before. A similar instability attends a second scene or thematic that has recently caught my eye, and that's Victor's election of himself to the role of martyr in the closing chapters of the novel, an election shadowed by his recognition that the dynamic of revenge against the creature, which will both prolong his life and award him death, is actually a vice. Visiting Oxford on the way to the abortive creation of the female, Victor had paused by the tomb of Puritan leader John Hampden and experienced a momentary elevation in identifying with the divine ideas of liberty and self-sacrifice of which these sites were the monuments. When, after Elizabeth's death, he fails to convince the Genevan magistrate to help him pursue the monster, he identifies in his own frenzy something of that haughty fierceness which the martyrs of old are said to have possessed. Well, the martyrs he has in mind, one imagined, are figures from the Protestant tradition. Indeed, his rebuke to the magistrate, "Man," I cried, "how ignorant art thou in the pride of thy wisdom," sounds very like the half-mad Covenanters of Scott's Old Mortality, who died in battle against those lukewarm Erastians and backsliding prelatists who were supporting the increasingly Anglo-Catholic monarchy of the Stuart dynasty. Much scholarship about Frankenstein, especially as its two protagonists go for each other's throats in revenge for suffered wrongs at the end, in defense of innocents martyred. Much of this is focused on the iconography of the French Revolution, Victor as the continental philosophe tradition of reform gone crazy, the creature as the just but horrific revenge of the abandoned poor. And this works very well, with martyrs from aristocracy and the philosophe tradition alike clamoring for spiritual and sometimes financial recognition in Romantic England. Readers would easily recognize both the humans who ineffectually use pistols on the creature and the creature whose hands around multiple throats are as effective as Madame la Guillotine. Yet a free-floating signifier as the designation martyr is, it has not yet, in this polymythic Gothic text of 1818, floated entirely free from the English Revolution, whose first Protestant martyrs were burned at the stake with bags of gunpowder tied to their throats in Mary Tudor's reign. Of course, later Catholic martyrs, Jesuits among them, were beheaded in King James's reign at the time of the gunpowder plot. Still, it was Catholics and Anglo-Catholics who stood in the English imagination for the rationalist, time-serving, power-oriented pride of wisdom. And it was the Geneva-inspired English Calvinists and Presbyterians who, in their haughty fierceness, called down the lightning bolts of the divine upon themselves and their enemies alike as the avengers of the primitive doctrine. Now, if it is these whose frenzy Victor Frankenstein echoes in his pursuit of vengeance, then what does that make the creature from the grave? Remade from old forms, the Catholic? New called from matter itself, the atheist? Abandoned but really hard to shake, the Catholic? Ardently desired but sort of frightening when you see it, atheism? Confident in its innocence, belief itself? Experienced in the bringing of things to death, atheism? Whoever this figure is in this reading, Victor Frankenstein can only awaken himself from the madness of grieving at the death of his brother, his wife, his father, by a resolution to take vengeance upon it. Speaking of his experience and his plan to the magistrate at Geneva, Victor sees incredulity in the man's face, but as he narrates his tale, the man became more attentive and interested. I saw him sometimes shudder with horror, at others a lively surprise, unmingled with disbelief, was painted on his countenance. He had heard my story with that half kind of belief that is given to a tale of spirits and supernatural events. Victor cannot rouse even this engaged listener to full belief, however. And even the mariner Walton, who is electrified by the personhood of Victor, is only dragged to half-belief in the tale by the sight of the letters of Felix and Safi. He fully believes only at the end, as the creature appears to mourn their mutual loss in Victor Frankenstein. What will make Margaret Saville believe, or even half-believe, the wild tale of her brother's letters? What about ourselves? Writing arrests attention, but belief comes only with the experience of his experience, which is fundamentally the giving of the self to a love which is then lost. The friend, the brother, the mother. The novel makes it clear that Victor turns to his work because he cannot sustain the loss of his mother, the death of the beloved that enters the soul as an outrage. Annie Dillard has explored this experience in a beautiful book called Holy the Firm, this lightning, this visit of the angel of electricity. The God of today, of ordinary life, sockets into everything, she contends, and yet, you can get caught holding one end of a love when your father drops and your mother, when a land is lost or a time, and your friend blotted out, gone, your brother's body spoiled, cold, your infant dead, and you dying. You reel out love's long line alone, stripped like a live wire, losing its sparks to a cloud, like a live wire loosed in space to longing and grief everlasting. I name it terror, she says, the farthest limb of the day, God's tooth. God's fork, Emily Dickinson names it in trustworthy pun. Here's her poem. The lightning is a yellow fork from tables in the sky by inadvertent fingers dropped. The awful cutlery of mansions never quite disclosed and never quite concealed. As we all try to look this lightning, this vanishing angel, in the face, but in the last line of the novel, he sprung from the cabin window and was soon borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. So good, we have time for further talk about Frankenstein.
Judith,
I was quoting from the 1818 edition, and you have the 1813, the 1831 edition. But I think all my quotes are in your edition, with additions later provided by Mary Shelley. So I don't quite know how to handle this, but anyhow, go ahead, Dennis.
could you restate any questions given to
Yes, I'll be glad to do that. Or there's a Mr. Microphone over here if people would like to pass the microphone around. Maybe that would be the simplest thing.
Judith, you touched on at the end. You touched on Walton at the end, and I wondered if you might reflect a little bit more about that curious character.
The question is Walton, that curious character. Thinking about Walton as one in several series, he is, like Victor, someone who wants a friend, someone to hold the other end of that long line, even though his sister, on his other hand, is holding the line of the letters. He's also a polar explorer, and scholarship on Frankenstein has been very interested in the last 15 years or so in the history of polar exploration, not simply as a metaphor for the farthest out kind of place, and not simply as the other side of the excruciatingly well worked out fire and ice imagery of the novel, but also as a real series of events, both in the English imagination of exploration and in the English pursuit of empire. So all of that is really interesting as well. Part of what interests me about Walton, in addition to this kind of unactualized, purely imaginary brother and sister relationship, is the way the novel moves from his words to elaborate words from Victor Frankenstein to a long monologue by Frankenstein's creature, and then sort of back out to Walton's words. And all of that culminates in an episode at the end, as you remember, where Walton is given the opportunity to make apparently a different kind of choice than Victor Frankenstein made about going over the edge, going farther than is morally proper. And when I first studied this, it all seemed very simple and obvious. Walton makes the right choice. Victor Frankenstein made the wrong choice. But if you look carefully at those last letters, what happens is that both men, Robert and Victor, kind of rocket back and forth between a recognition of the necessity and the humanity and maybe even the science of limits and a respect for that, and the romantic wish to find borders crossable and limits pusillanimous. And so the story doesn't really come to rest. And of course, his last words are the ones I read at the end. They are not words to his sister or words to himself about lessons learned. They are a simple, powerful description of a fact we sometimes forget, that the monster has not yet died, and may never. And more power to him. Bob, yeah.
Judith, I wonder if you could say something more about the relationship of the novel to Paradise Lost, which I find immensely, continue to always find very intriguing. And to what extent is Mary Shelley thinking about justifying the ways of God to man, or justifying the ways of Frankenstein to humankind?
Yes, the question kind of is in two parts. What is the relationship of the novel to Paradise Lost, which is clearly evoked on the title page and then exists as a text inside this text, and then if Paradise Lost, among other things, is an attempt to justify God's ways to man, or Victor's ways, or unjustify Victor's ways, how conscious is Mary Shelley of all that? Again, I used to think I knew the answer to that question. I used to think that Mary Shelley was a kind of warning text, as Paradise Lost intended to be a kind of warning text about the angel of electricity, about Lucifer, and that Victor showed the wrong way to go and that Robert Walton showed the right way to go. But it's all just much more complicated than that. I expect that you'll be talking a lot about that in your class, that the text of Paradise Lost is mixed with various other texts deliberately. There's a satchel of several texts from Western civilization. And the creature simply begins interpreting all of those texts to fit or reflect his situation. And so already inside that little interaction between the creature and Paradise Lost, there is raised the specter of interpretation as distinct from, or at least in somewhere on the borderline of truth. And what else? When I first wrote about Frankenstein, I was also interested in various trinities, especially the trinity that Milton works out in Paradise Lost of Satan, sin, and death. And as I thought about Satan, sin, and death and laid that over Victor, the creature, and the creature's actions, I thought I knew what was being said about that part of Paradise Lost too. But now I'm not so sure, because I'm thinking about laying over that trinity rather Victor's father, Victor, and the creature, and imagining that maybe Victor was somehow his father's sin, and the creature might be Victor and his father's death. Justifying either Victor or an anti-Victor, I don't think the novel can be said to simply do that, certainly not in the 1818 edition. The closest you can come to a stable, even philosophical, let alone religious interpretation, even in the 1831 version, I would say, is something closer to Greek Stoicism than to Miltonic certainty. And as in the 1818 edition, it's all up for grabs and lost in darkness and especially distance. But on the way to that conclusion, there are just endlessly interesting, wonderful things to be done with all sorts of different passages from Paradise Lost, including that one. One more from Dennis, and then I want to say one tiny thing.
Just a couple of other Catholic images as I was reading through it. Elizabeth, where the sacred soul of Elizabeth shown at the shrine dedicated lamp in our peaceful home. And then Justine, so abused by the priest, of course, nevertheless is called a saintly sufferer. What do you do with those?
I'm not absolutely sure of this, Dennis, but I almost suspect that the passages you just read, the question was, the observation was, there are even more kind of Catholic images than I suggested. It's possible, I would almost want to bet that those are from the 1831 edition, but can you tell me whether you're reading the 1818 or the 1831 edition? In any case, like the word martyr, the word saint, as you know, is by the early 1800s a free-floating signifier, much claimed by Protestant traditions, as well as Catholic, and also claimed by non-religious traditions in that kind of odd slide, which you can either regard as the recalcitrance of language or the return of the repressed, claimed by many non-religious kinds of movements or conditions or situations where a concept like sainthood seems to fit. Chris?
Can you explain I guess the relay between what you're calling a braided narrative and what you're calling serial? Only because when I think of a serial, and obviously I'm thinking back from serial killer narratives, where each moment of a reproduction or a copycatting of a previous crime constitutes kind of emptying out of it's a kind of declension story where each one becomes more frantic and less meaningful than the one before it. So I hear braiding as somehow giving equivalence to these three threads that are sort of channeling through the monster and the victims. But I wonder if serial functions in quite the same way, since you're also punning off reproduction and bad reproduction.
I can only begin to answer that question, which is working back from my reference to serial killers, to ask a question about what dimensionality, what kind of relationship is there to a phrase I've been using, and she uses like serial, and a phrase I've been using like braided. braided seems to offer an equivalency. And serial, Chris says, working from certain psychological imaginations of what actually goes on in the minds of serial killers in the 20th century, serial seems to be moving towards some kind of breakdown. That is, psychologists seem to feel that when a serial killer repeats whatever trauma is engaging him, or very occasionally, actually I'm not even sure there is one, her, the repetition grows ever more frantic, as though, to use a kind of old phrase, the killer actually wants to be caught. That would mean that the end of the serial is not, so to speak, going somewhere except to death, but rather losing parts of itself or breaking down. And I guess I'm thinking of a different kind of, or not. I don't want it to be that notion of serial. I'm not sure if I want it to be something closer to the notion of mathematical series. But I think I want it to be something closer to the idea of mathematical series, if only because, as I discovered, the movement of mathematical series, 2, 4, 6, 8, or however you imagine the spaces in a mathematical series, definitely looks like it's progressing, but then could either go somewhere triumphantly and complete itself, or doesn't need to, but can turn back on itself, or fly apart entirely, or move to the surd or the absurd. So I guess now that you mention it, it would be interesting to think about the series. Maybe it would be interesting to think about the series of Victor's being as being slightly more like that, and the series of the creatures being as something more ineffable and less breakdownable. But then I only say that because that's what I want it to be. But then that's why I get to say it. Series is so fun. Let me close by adverting to the first Frankenstein text that the class was invited to buy or read is by mistake. You know what global books in print looks like these days? You can hardly read it or kind of tell from all the information. But you would have thought Oxford University Press that it would be the real Frankenstein, but instead it is a Frankenstein for grade 5 whose vocabulary is restricted to 5,000 head words. It's a wonderful, wonderful text to think about. Think of the English majors who are now employed in rewriting Frankenstein with a vocabulary of 5,000 words. And once I picked it up, I had to read it. And there are all sorts of interesting things to say about what it leaves out. But here's something that it puts in that is astounding. Well, you could guess. Take a guess. If this version of Frankenstein is on the whole kind of taking things out and collapsing things down and smoothing things in for sixth graders, but then it decides to amplify something at some point, what do you think it will decide to amplify? Not the religious messages, not the political undertone. Here's the moment when the female creature is not created. I'm going to read you this. You remember the scene at the window. His face was filled, the monster's face. He's not going to create my Eve. The monster's face was filled with trickery and cunning. I knew then that he could not be trusted and that I had made a terrible mistake. I trembled with fear and anger. I began to tear the creature to pieces with my bare hands. Soon they became covered with blood and pieces of muscle. My fingernails were choked with skin and hair. I almost fainted with disgust and horror. Those details are nowhere in Mary Shelley, and I just leave you to think about, not to mention that the picture actually shows limbs being torn off. The unactualized female creature. I don't know what to say about that, but I'll leave you to talk about that, and thanks for your attention again.